Hi, everybody. This is Empowering Democracy. I'm your host, Joe Firestone. And our topic for tonight is the Hyper-Imperialism Report, Part 2. It's not actually Part 2 of the report. It's just my second stream, on the subject. There are parts to the report, though, and tonight we're going to cover Parts 4, and 5. And, hey, Dolores, how are you doing? Okay, Dolores Pierce is here. I'm going to go right to the report, right to Part 5. And you'll see why I selected Part 5, and the epilogue as we go forward as representative of the whole report. Let me share the report, the web version of it. Part 5 covers changes in the world order. A southward shift of the economic base. And you're now seeing a graphic. This is the global south versus the global north. It represents the share of the GDP of the world. Now, this is GDP transformed to reflect purchasing power parity. So it isn't GDP in dollars, it's GDP in purchasing power parity dollars. And the graph covers the period 1993 to 2022. And you notice in 1993, the global north accounted for nearly 60%. And then over that period of time, gradually the share of GDP of the global north, purchasing power parity, fell to 40.6%. And the share of the global south increased from 42% to 59.4%. So the global south has become economically dominant over the global north, and the trend continues. There's no indication that that trend is going to turn around. We can talk about the reasons for that at some later time, but there are the years. The global south had a greater share than the global north beginning in 2007. If you look at this from the standpoint of purchasing power parity GDP. As of 2022, again, it was 59.4% to 40.6%. It's now 2024, so the likelihood is that the global south is greater than 60% now, and the global north is less than 40% in terms of purchasing power parity. When we read the text, below, at the end of the Cold War in 1993, the global north accounted for 57.2% of the global GDP, while the global south accounted for 42.8%. 30 years later, these proportions are definitively inverted, says the report. The share of the global south has reached 59.4%, with the global north holding at 40.6%. And again, this is as of 2022. It is now about, 16 months later. And so there we are. Now this is a graph of the BRICS nations, the original BRICS nations, not BRICS 10. The 6 BRICS nations. Sorry, the 5 BRICS nations versus the G7. And this is the share of the GDP of the world expressed in PPP terms. And you see that when we look at it that way, the BRICS nations, as of 2022, well, they started out lower than 20%. As of 2022, they were at 31.5%, and the G7 was at 30.3%. The G7, which includes the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, and Japan. These are the core economic countries of the global North Bloc. In 1993, these countries accounted for 45.4% of the global economy. Meanwhile, the most significant economies of the global South, such as the BRICS nations themselves, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, made up only 16.7% of the global economy in that year. And that's measured in PPP. It was even less if you just take it in dollars without any adjustment. Among the BRICS nations, Russia had just emerged after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and China was deepening its economic reforms and establishing a socialist market economy. Neither Russia nor China were competitors to the G7 at the time. 30 years later, the BRICS countries accounted for 31.5% of the global economy, having surpassed the G7, which was at 30.3%, as shown in the figure we just examined. Now, what about BRICS 10 versus G7? Even though there was no BRICS 10 at the end of 2022, there is BRICS 10 now. So you can look at the nations of BRICS 10 and look at where they've gone. Okay, and you can look at the G7 and look where the G7 has gone. If you look at that in GDP terms, you notice that G7 again was at 45.3%. At the end of the period in 2022, it was at 30.3%. But the BRICS 10 started out at roughly 22%. I'll get the exact figure in just a minute. But it ended 2022 at 35.6%. So the minute the BRICS nations came into BRICS 10, the new BRICS editions, there developed a 5-point gap in the share of GDP between BRICS 10 and the G7. In August of 2023, BRICS expanded by inviting 6 countries: Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, the United Arab Emirates, UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Argentina. Although Argentina has now temporarily declined, BRICS 10, excluding Argentina, added 4% to BRICS' share of the GDP of the world expressed in PPP terms. So that's important to note. Here's another figure. This is China versus the United States. Now, let's be clear again. What we're looking at here is we're looking at changes from 1993 through 2022. So Uh, if we look at China versus the United States in terms of share of world GDP in PPP terms, China was just about at 5%, maybe a little less than 5% in 1993. Now China is at 18.4% of GDP. The United States was just short of 20% of GDP, probably about 19%. And the United States GDP as a proportion of world GDP has fallen to 15.5%. So as of the end of 2022, Chinese GDP as a proportion of world GDP was close to 3 points higher than the United States share. The absolute leader of the global north, the U.S., has seen its share of the world economy slowly decline in PPP terms from 19.7% in 1993 to 15.5% in 2022. In the global south, China's rapid rise has been the most notable variable. China only accounted for 5% of the world economy in 1993. By 2016, China's economy had surpassed that of the United States in PPP terms. So 2016 was 8 years ago. China surpassed us in GDP measured in PPP terms, purchasing power parity terms, already by 8 years ago. By 2022, China's share of the world economy had reached 18.4%. This marks the first time in over 600 years that a non-white dominated country has economically broken through the hegemony of the white imperialist countries. This economic reality led the U.S. to urgently begin to try to suppress China's rise. Okay, if you ask me if this was what was worrying people, then they were really very, very late, to respond, because if you look at the graphic, people could have been looking at this graphic, and they certainly could have seen what was coming by, well, even as early as 2001 or 2002, even as early as the start of the Bush administration. Certainly by the time that China's GDP reached 10% of world GDP in 2006, they should have been able to recognize that if they wanted to stem the tide, to stop this, they should have begun to do things then. When we were still about 17% of the economy, 17% of the world economy. But of course, nobody had any foresight. What people were looking at was the money that American corporations made by dealing economically with China. Now, I don't want to give the impression that I'm suggesting that China surpassing the United States is a bad thing. I don't personally think that. I think it's perfectly appropriate that a nation of 1.4 billion people at various times during this period, 1.5 billion people, should have a greater share of GDP than a nation of only 330 million people. So, it doesn't seem to me that this is unfair or unjust, or unexpected. It's just the world essentially righting itself. So, Okay, I don't look at this as some kind of crisis that we ought to be responding to. I think we should be responding to certain things, like, for example, bringing home or starting certain industries that are vital to our national security and and also our national well-being, because you can't assume that the international trading system uh, is going to be completely open to the United States forever. So the things we really need should, to the extent that that's possible, be made here, should be mined here, should be created here. That's serving our public purpose, okay, our national interest. I don't even want to say the national interest is the same thing as the public purpose, because the two are able to diverge. But I don't want to go into this, okay, at this point. But the point is that when China was very rapidly beginning to approach us as a percent of share of world GDP, we should have been taking action to see that we were perhaps not so dependent on China. If people thought that our being dependent on China was not in our in line with our concept of the public purpose. I'm not even sure that that's true. It may be that our dependency on China, okay, is a good thing, but that has never really been debated here. It's always been assumed that we were the hegemon and we were going to be the hegemon, and we had the power to continue to be the hegemon, and there was no serious discussion of whether China's challenge was contrary to the public purpose of the United States. We haven't even been entertaining the question of whether the fall of GDP, or at least percentage GDP, as a percentage of world GDP, was contrary to the public purpose of the United States. It might not be. It depends on what we think the public purpose is. I have lots and lots of ideas on that, but the point is there hasn't been any debate about that. We've just been sitting around watching this happen, not really planning anything, and beginning to take very hostile actions towards China since what, 2012, 2013, without even any public debate as to whether it was in our interest or in accord with our public purpose to do these things. So, here's another figure, figure 43. This is about the global south, excluding China, versus the global north share of world GDP. Excluding China, the global north in 1993 was just short of 60% of the share of the world. Okay, the global south was at roughly 39%. But at the end of the period, the global south, excluding China, was at 41%, and the global north was at 40.6%. So the point is, China's rise is not the only reason why the global south has grown to have a greater share of world GDP than the global north. And the text says, however, it would be a mistake to view China as the sole source of growth for the global south. Even without China, the economies of the global south had surpassed the global north by 2022, with their respective shares of the global economy at 41% and 40.6%. The overall economic development of the Global South has enabled them to objectively have the capacity and to seek a more just international order, which is contrary to the wishes of the imperialist bloc of the Global North. And I'm going to emphasize that by highlighting it, okay, in yellow. That's a very important conclusion. Figure 44, the Global South, 43, the 43 nations, most important 43 nations of the Global South, versus the United States in share of world GDP. The Global South 43 started out at about roughly 26%, with the United States at 19% and change. And the Global South kept on going up, whereas the United States, after a very small rise, started steadily declining. And the Global South's 43 had 41.1% share at the end of 2022. And the United States was at 15.5% again, that figure. So we have identified all 43 countries whose shares of the world GDP in PPP terms amounts to 41.1% that are part of one or more of the three new non-imperialist controlled international organizations. This is an interesting way to look at it. There are three such organizations. The BRICS 10, that was founded in 2009. Of course, it wasn't the BRICS 10 then. It was the actually just 4 countries, because South Africa joined in 2010, I believe. So it was the BRIC founded in 2009. It became the BRICS, and then 4 other nations were added to make it BRICS. 5 other nations were added to make it BRICS 10 just last year. Yeah, this says expanded in 2010, expanded to include South Africa, and then expanded again in 2023. The second international organization, which is new, it was founded as the Shanghai Five in 1996, expanded in 2001, 2017, and 2023, now called the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the SCO. Now, the BRICS 10 is predominantly an economic organization. It's an organization for promoting economic deals and, doing economic affair. But the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is broader in its scope and includes also defense and military concern. So if you want to compare the Shanghai Cooperation Organization to something, probably should be compared, to NATO, but it's not such a tight alliance, as NATO. It's not so formalized in terms of rules. You will do this, you will do that under these conditions, and so on. But the third organization, and I think this is very significant, I had actually never heard of this organization before this report, and the group of friends in defense of the Charter of the United Nations, found in 2021. The full list of friends is provided in a later section. But so there's a group of nations that meet for the defense of the Charter of the United Nations. The group was founded in 2021, doesn't include the United States and the nations of the Global North because, well, I think to the shame of ourselves, we have not been defending the Charter of the United Nations and do not seem interested in doing that. We seemed interested instead in founding a new rules-based order for international relations, which in many instances proved to be contrary to the Charter, okay, of the United Nations and in opposition to the Charter, okay, of the United Nations. So who's defending, okay, the United Nations? Not the group of nations that started it, but rather a group of developing nations that has become interested in upholding the Charter, okay, of the United Nations. Well, here's another graphic, figure 45, Global South 21 versus the G7, average annual growth rate. The nations in red in this graphic, which include China, Bangladesh, Vietnam, India, Turkey, Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, Republic of Korea, that is I don't know if that's North Korea or South Korea, but it's one of the Koreas. I suspect it's actually South Korea. But anyway, then Egypt, Pakistan, Colombia, Thailand, okay, and then Russia, okay, and Iran. Now, generally speaking, the growth rates of the nations in red greatly exceed the growth rates, the annual growth rate average. China, not surprisingly, is the highest nation, 5.8%. However, Bangladesh over this period of time has been at 5.3%. China, of course, everyone will note, is a communist country. However, Bangladesh is not, but it has nearly as high a growth rate. Also, Vietnam, 4.9%. The growth rate of India has been 4.6% since that time. Turkey's growth rate, 4.0%. Okay, these are growth rates, okay, that are among the highest in the world, but there's then a sharp drop after 4.0%. There's a drop to 3.3%. That's the Philippines. 3.1% for Indonesia, okay, and also for Malaysia. Then you have a bunch of countries that are between 2.4% and 1.5%. The only nation of the global north that's above the 1% level, that's at 1.5%, okay, is the United States. All of the other nations of the global north are less than 1%. Now, there are some global south nations that are less than 1% also. They include Russia, 0.8%, Iran, 0.8%, Saudi Arabia, 0.4%, Mexico, 0.1%. So those global south nations have very low rates of growth. And then there are some global south nations that even have negative rates of growth over this period. One is Nigeria. It's minus 0.4%. One is South Africa, minus 0.4%. Worst of all is Argentina, minus 0.7%. One global south country, specifically Brazil, is at 0%, neither negative nor positive, over the period from, let me check the time. No, this was GDP purchasing power parity per capita, um, average annual growth rate between 2012 and 2022. Didn't start in 1993 in this case, but from 2012 to 2022, okay, a period, okay, of 11 years. Generally speaking, the nations of the Global South 21, had a much higher average annual growth rate. Very important, okay, to know that. Okay, this is when GDP is expressed in PPP terms. China, of course, was the leader again. The next 5 countries with the highest growth rates are Bangladesh, 5.3, Vietnam, 4.9, India, 4.6, and the Philippines, 3.3, and Indonesia, 3.1%. Aside from the United States, the rest of the G7 countries have an average per capita growth rate of less than 1%. Regrettably, the largest economies in Africa and Latin America have experienced negative per capita growth. Nigeria and South Africa at minus 0.4%, and Brazil and Argentina at 0% and minus 0.7%, respectively. The report says, of course, we acknowledge that growth rates themselves can mask the intense class struggles within these countries, where the share of the growth is not nearly equitably distributed between capital and labor. However, it would be a mistake to ignore the growth rates and what their trend lines, okay, describe. So even though this doesn't allow us to break the trends by class, so we can see what's going on there, the overall rates of growth are still very revealing. One of the most significant changes in the world economy of the last 20 years has been a dramatic shift in the geography of world industrial production. The World Bank publishes the industry percentage of GDP using the current prices and current exchange rates, which this study refers to as the current exchange rate CER method. Currently, we are unaware of any published industry percentages for GDP PPP calculations. So they couldn't do the calculations for PPP because the data wasn't available. So they had to use the CER, which is more favorable, of course, to the global north countries. This graphic, figure 46, gives you the global south versus the global north share of world industry value added. So you see at the start of the period when this started, which was, 2004 is when these figures started. So 2004 to 2022, the global north is up at 70% in terms of industrial value added. At the end of the period, the global north is down to 43%. The global south starts at just over 31% and grows to 56.3% in 2022. And there are some other lines also. There's the global south excluding China. That grows from roughly 22% to 30%. That's even excluding China. And we can compare that to China. China's growth was from roughly about 8% of industrial value added to 26.3% of value added. There had been a decline in China's value added in 2000. It peaked in 2021, actually. And at that point is at roughly 27%. It went down slightly to 26.3%. And here's the United States. In industrial value added, it started out at about 22%. and fell to 16.7%, compared, of course, to China's 26.3%. Very interesting statistic, don't you think? Here's the global south versus the global north with the share of world industry value added. And the first line here starts at about 58%, goes up to 69.4% for the global south. The global south, excluding China, starts at something like 44%. And excluding China, it stays pretty flat, ends at 43.7%. So the share of world industry value added, excluding China, does not go up. It's a pretty flat curve. With China in it, it's an increasing curve that ends at 69.4%. However, the global north, which starts at about the same level as the global south in value added in 2004, falls from that 44% figure to 30.6%. China itself goes from 8% to 25.7%. And the United States goes from looks like it's about 14% to 9.7%. In terms of share of world industry value added. Let's see how the text expresses this. Figures 46 and 47 show changes in the percentage of industry value added in GDP for both CER and PPP terms over the last 18 years. It is likely that the figures of the industry value added world share are somewhere in between the CER and the PPP. Subsequent charts in this series are shown only for the PPP method and have the same qualifications as made for the first of the series. What we see is that there is indeed a change in the base of the economy, with the global south home to the majority share. Despite the many predictions of a new post-industrial society, no major society, no major country has achieved the state of modernization without industrialization. One thing this report does not address whether major countries that have gotten to a modern stage can move to a post-industrial society while de-industrializing. That's a very important question, because obviously the United States, over a period of time, and lots of the global north nations have de-industrialized. Here is a very interesting graphic, the BRICS 10 versus the G7. The share of world industry value added. The BRICS 10 starts at about 33%, goes up to 44%. The G7 starts at about the same place, a little under that 33%, but declines to 21.6%. So the BRICS 10 share of world industry value added is more than twice, as of 2022, the share of world industry value added for the G7. And they say in the text, the world share of industry value added of BRICS 10 is now double that of G7. More than double that, 44% to 21.6%. More than double by a slight amount. Now, figure 49, selected countries, share of world industry value added. France, Germany, India, Japan, Russia, and the UK. India starts at maybe 4.9%, At the end of the period, it's at 6.5%. Japan starts at industry value added 6.5% roughly, ends at 3.5%. So Japan's share of world industry value added has dropped rather precipitously over the period 2004 to 2022. Russia starts at maybe 2.5%, increases to 3.7% in terms of world industry value added over that period of time. And here's a graph for Germany. It starts at, let's say, 3.8% and declines somewhat to 3%. Here's the United Kingdom. It starts at maybe 2.1% and declines to 1.4%. France starts at 2% and it declines to 1.4%. So primary nations of the global north, major nations, not including the United States, were steadily declining. Japan's decline was rather precipitous in terms of world industry value added. The results show the following for industry value added as a percentage of the world using GDP PPP. China is the world's leading industrial country with 25.7% share value added, while the U.S. holds only a 9.7% share. The Global South has a 69.4% share, while the Global North has a 30.6% value-added share. BRICS 10 has a 44% and exceeds the G7, doubles the G7. The share of Japan, Germany, France, and the UK are also declining, whilst India is increasing. We use the World Bank industry percentage multiplied by the annual GDP PPP for each country for each year to derive a country-based industrial value added. We then use these to calculate the percentage of total world industry value added by each country and country grouping category. There are some limitations and complex issues regarding this methodology. Some economists have tried to minimize this change. Some argue that U.S. dollar monopolies and ownership of large multinational corporations mean GDP figures overstate the change. China, at a minimum, cannot be said to have all its production under the lock and key of the U.S. Even in India, it is a mistake to understate the significance of a growing big national bourgeoisie, albeit large sections of it politically reactionary. Moving industrial production to the global south could only have occurred with massive improvements in their infrastructure. A good point. You couldn't have moved industrial production to the global south without building the infrastructure to handle it. And you know that in the case of China, and probably to a great degree in the case of India also, there have been massive improvements in their infrastructure. In his parting words to Russian President Vladimir Putin during his state visit in March 2023, Chinese President Xi Jinping says, quote, "Right now, there are changes, the likes of which we haven't seen for 100 years, and we are the ones driving these changes together," unquote. Eurasia is now center stage for determining the future, the next period of human existence. And of course, a lot of live streams we've done here on this program have shown Eurasia is the center and will most probably be the center for what is going on unless we, the United States, change our economic orientation greatly. And I will talk about that at some point. I don't know if I'll have time tonight, but I will get to that. U.S. strategy to curtail China's economic growth and influence. 2007, Vladimir Putin delivered his famous Munich speech criticizing U.S. monopolistic dominance, quote, almost uncontained hyper-use of force, uh, a military force in international relations, force that is plunging the world into an abyss of permanent conflicts. In the same year, the Center for New American Security, CNAS, was formed. By 2009, secret U.S. cables to Washington revealed by WikiLeaks stated she knows how very corrupt China is and is repulsed by the all-encompassing commercialization of Chinese society with its intended nouveau riche, official cooperation, loss of values, dignity, and self-respect, and uh, 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 moral evils, quote unquote, such as drugs and prostitution. When Xi takes the helm of the party, he might aggressively attempt to address these evils, perhaps at the expense of the new moneyed class. The alarm bells in Langley and Foggy Bottom were ringing. Langley, of course, the CIA. Foggy Bottom is the State Department. The West dream for the rise of a Chinese Gorbachev, quote unquote, was eviscerated in 2012. It became clear that an economically ascendant China would not be imminently defeated. Thus, the pivot to Asia strategy began integrating its allies to contain China. Then U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton publicly demanded that the 21st century will be America's Pacific century. In contrast, Xi Jinping said to U.S. President Barack Obama, quote, the Pacific Ocean is broad enough to accommodate the development of both China and the United States. Not a hostile statement, I think, just a neutral statement and a true statement. It's broad enough to accommodate both. But we haven't wanted to accommodate both. We wanted to go the Hillary Clinton route. By 2016, China's GDP, calculated by purchasing power parity, had surpassed that of the United States. In 2020, the Center for Economics and Business Research predicted that by 2028, China's GDP measured in U.S. dollars, not PPP, but regular U.S. dollars, would overtake that of the U.S., a forecast that became a, quote, demon barrier, unquote. U.S. officials repeatedly defined China as the most significant strategic threat facing the U.S. and the global north. The relative decline of U.S. power, the rise of socialist China, and the economic growth of the global south are key reasons behind U.S. active subordination and subsequent integration of the rest of the imperialist countries. This has led to a full military, political, and economic bloc under U.S. control. In 1998, former U.S. National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski, otherwise known as Zbig, warned, quote, the most dangerous scenario would be a grand coalition of Russia, China, and perhaps Iran, not out of sudden love for one another, but out of a shared opposition to the predominant power, okay, the U.S. He was mistaken about that. It looks like China and Russia have considerable love, okay, for one another. CNAS, formed by a combination of neocons and liberal hawks, spawned a core cadre of U.S. policy elites from both parties who focused on developing a new geopolitical strategy for the U.S. By 2021, ignoring Brzezinski's warning, they began publicly promoting the preparation for simultaneous wars. Significant figures from CNAS, including Secretary of State Antony Blinken, Deputy Secretary of State Kurt Campbell, he's the guy who replaced Victoria Nuland, and former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy Michelle Flournoy. Oh, there's a Madame Lafarge for you. Former CNAS staff and consultants have permeated strategic organs of the state, including the National Security Council. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, whilst not a member of CNAS, now plays a dominant role in the presidency and pursues the same international strategy. April 2023 gave a speech titled, quote, Renewing American Economic Leadership, unquote, at the Brookings Institute. I'm going to say right now, these jazzbos don't know how to renew American economic leadership because they don't know any MMT at all. This speech was significant for three distinct reasons. First, it is very unusual for such an important speech on the U.S. economy to be given by a national security advisor. Historically, national security advisors like Henry Kissinger's stayed in the realms of national security, geopolitics, and military affairs. Second, Sullivan's speech sought to create a, quote, new Washington consensus, unquote, to reestablish the U.S. economic hegemony. Third, Sullivan acknowledged the depth of the U.S. structural crisis, including its economic stagnation. But he doesn't know what to do about that economic stagnation, does he? This economic plan is required to support uh, uh, support uh, 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 military expansion. In July 2023, the U.S. proposed a bill to add U.S. $345 million in military aid to Taiwan. From Tel Aviv to Kiev to Taipei, the U.S. is escalating its military operations to the doorsteps of Asia. Cold wars, necessarily associated with conflicts between nuclear powers, are always dangerous. In 1988, Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky published the book The Manufacturing Consent, the political economy of the mass media, in which they decried the, quote, propaganda model, unquote, utilized by the U.S. corporate media, often in partnership with the state. They wrote it long before that system was able to avail itself of the new technological tools of surveillance and targeted communication characterizing the digital age. Thanks to whistleblower Edward Snowden, the world was able to get a glimpse of the vast expanse of U.S. control over all communications and how it has integrated all the U.S. IT tech monopoly platforms into adjuncts of U.S. national security infrastructure. Quote, collect it all was how a former senior intelligence officer described the National Security Agency's former director Keith Alexander's approach to data collection. All the emails, phone calls, and text messages of all types, including those of WhatsApp, Telegram, and Signal, every keystroke and every URL are captured for the vast majority of the world's population outside of China, Russia, and a few other countries. They're stored in vast networks of hard drives in locations such as Bluffdale, Utah. The U.S. created a global network able to capture and manage nearly every packet of data on all undersea optical cables, all cellular traffic, and satellite data traffic. Despite the military hegemony, capital still needs the approximation of consent. Over time, new techniques such as machine learning created a qualitative leap in the ability of the U.S. to conduct psychological secret warfare against the people of the global south and their populations. The economic models of all media companies collapsed with the advent of the internet and the creation of economic tech monopolies, which disintermediated all media profits. A new era of fully weaponized media outlets began, a development that is part of the overall hybrid war strategy, including economic sanctions and diplomatic isolation, that has been utilized by the U.S. establishment around the world. The pivot to Asia, in reality a pivot to China, began formally in 2012 under Obama. The U.S. combined propaganda, diplomatic, economic, and political strategies to try to curb at first China's economic development, and later its growing influence in institutions such as BRICS. Starting in 2016, Trump attempted to avoid conflict with Russia and began to focus all U.S. energies against China. Over the last 8 years, the U.S. used a coterie of selected and curated topics to define the Western media narrative on China. Despite millions of dead Muslims at the hands of NATO forces in Yemen, Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan, the West managed to integrate their formal array of soft power resources to wage a fierce Cold War against China. Even the chief propagandist of the Nazis, that Joseph Goebbels, might have been amazed at the hubris of the West in claiming the mantle of human rights and attempting to use Xinjiang as the whipping point against China. Larry Wilkerson, former chief of staff, Secretary of State Colin Powell, and former Army colonel, noted that important strategic goal of the of the U.S. military's invasion and long-term stationing in Afghanistan was to contain China's Belt and Road Initiative, 2013 to the present, and to create ethnic divisions and social unrest in Xinjiang. The New York Times, The Guardian, and the BBC became central props in a hallmark U.S. PSYOPs campaign. As we have explained in the economic analysis of Western economies, it is not irrational for the West to seek to retard China's growth. Central to the next stage, of development. Well, I don't know if it's not irrational. I would like to debate whether it's irrational or not irrational. But central to the next stage of development of China's economy is promoting a dual circulation economy, i.e., to increase the weight of the domestic market while continuing to keep growing in international trade, switching to high-quality development and advancing the economic development of the western provinces of China. To attack Xinjiang simultaneously accomplishes many Western interests, weakens China's domestic growth strategies, isolates China internationally, masks U.S. violence against Muslim countries, and continues to support extremist groups to destabilize their adversaries. Fabricated allegations of genocide, among the Uyghur population in Xinjiang, entirely unsubstantiated by the U.S. State Department, enabled the U.S. government to impose sanctions on China, aiming to strike at China's entire textile industry chain, which exports more than U.S. $300 billion and accounts for over one-third of the world's textile exports, ranking first on a global basis. But despite U.S. sanctions, Xinjiang's foreign trade surged by 51.25% year on year, reaching U.S. $30 billion in the first 3 quarters of 2023, with trade with 5 Central Asian nations increasing by 59.1%. China's just announced a free trade zone in Xinjiang to promote connectivity with regional Belt and Road countries. In addition to soft power warfare, quote unquote, the U.S. spared no attempt to contain China's development in high-tech sectors, especially in weakening China's capacity to produce or even purchase top-end semiconductor chips. By imposing long-arm jurisdiction on technology such as extreme ultraviolet EUV lithography machines manufactured by the Dutch company ASML, the U.S. seeks to prevent China from entering the future of chip technology. The Biden administration believes its impact will extend far beyond weakening China's military achievements, but also threatening China's economic growth and scientific leadership. Gregory C. Allen, director of the Artificial Intelligence Governance Project and senior fellow in the Emerging Technology Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, believes that the message conveyed by the export controls against China issued by the U.S. Bureau of Industry and Security, BIS, in October 2022, is part of, quote, a new U.S. policy of actively strangling large segment of the Chinese technology industry, strangling with an intent to kill, unquote. C.J. Muse, an industry analyst in the United States, stated, quote, if you told me about these rules 5 years ago, I would have told you that's an act of war. We'd have to be at war, unquote. Here's a graphic, figure 50, China, United States, and Eurozone, accumulated GDP growth. So you see the accumulated GDP growth of China from the starting point, 2019, I think it should be 2009 to 2019, China's growth has been 20.2%. The growth of the United States after an initial decline is at 8.1%, and the Eurozone growth after initial decline, which represented the recession in 2009, the growth of the Eurozone was 3.0%. So the global north is represented by the Eurozone, in the United States, far slower growth than China. Despite severe restrictions by the U.S., China continues to outgrow the global north. Through the Belt and Road Initiative, China strengthens its economic connections with the global south from 2013 to 2022. China's total change volume with countries participating in the Belt and Road Initiative reached US dollars 19.1 trillion. That's trade. That's not GDP. That's trade, with an average annual increase of 6.4%. Cumulative bilateral investment exceeded 380 billion US dollars, and China's foreign direct investment exceeded 240 billion US dollars. China's new contracted projects reached 2 trillion US dollars, with a cumulative turnover of 1.3 trillion US dollars completed. That's enormous. Ironically, U.S. containment in high-tech fields has only strengthened China's resolve for self-reliance and innovation. In recent years, China has made significant breakthroughs in independent innovation, high-end chips, electric vehicles, and digital technology, making the U.S. blockade and containment in high-tech fields increasingly unrealistic. Okay, I'm going to have to stop now. I'll come back tomorrow, and I will complete this, at that time. But you can see the great scope of the economic changes that are taking place, in the world. And these are changes that are a fait accompli. They have already happened. There's nothing we can do about them at this point. Well, I shouldn't say there's nothing we could do about them. We could grow much faster ourselves, and we could pursue policies with the global north so that the global north grew much faster as well. We could do that by increasing our internal prosperity and the sophistication of our own societies. We could modernize our infrastructure. We could create large-scale benefits for people. We could make the transition from fossil fuel technology to a renewable resources technology. We could do that. And that might result in changing the global shares of GDP and the industry value added, as well. But we have to change our economy, to do that. Tomorrow, I'll continue this discussion of changes. I then will move to the epilogue, of the report, which talks about a credible political and economic alternative world order. And I'll talk about how we might do something about all this by paying attention to our own economic growth and our own economic changes, and our own societies, and how we might do that by ending neoliberalism, by stopping putting profits before people, and by adopting a much more socialist economy, ourselves. But that discussion will have to wait for tomorrow. At this point, I must go over and join Dee on her stream. I do want to take some of the comments, if there are any substantive comments beyond the hellos. There's somebody new who's arrived, okay, by the name of Wesley Wiles. Oh, Teresa Sanders was here. Shared hello and viva la revolution. Ha. And so those are the comments. So therefore, I am going to end at this point and go over to join Dee, because she won't be with Madeline, okay, this week. So it's really important, okay, that I go over there. So I'm going to end the stream now, and I'll see you tomorrow for the end of this. And I'll probably have time tomorrow to take on some other news. There may be some new developments on Pepe Escobar's story about the F-35 stuff, okay, by then. So good night from me tonight, and I will see you tomorrow. And you might want to come over to Dee's, okay, along with me.